Throughout time, people across the world told each other tales of how they came to be, of heroes and monsters, romance and tragedy, death and rebirth. Mythology helped shape the ancient world, explaining the unexplainable. This is Mythology Unleashed. New Orleans, Louisiana is a city unlike any other. From the French Quarter, to the Garden District, to the neighboring bayou, there is something magnetic, musical, and practically magical emanating from every corner, a feeling felt by locals and tourists alike. Being so rich in its unique flavor of culture, New Orleans has developed a grand amount of folklore and urban legends, perhaps the most prevalent of which is ghost stories and paranormal activity. Legends of evil spirits, benevolent specters, mournful souls, phantom lights, and paranormal encounters with spooks of every variety. There are perhaps more ghost stories connected to the Big Easy than any other city in America, and this program will detail the stories of a handful of ghosts of New Orleans. The stories of ghosts in New Orleans go as far back as the founding of the city in the 1700s. In the French Quarter, near Jackson Square, stands the oldest continually operating cathedral in America, St. Louis Cathedral. Named after King Louis IX of France, the only French monarch to attain sainthood, the cathedral's chapel, towers, and surrounding alleyways are said to be the haunts of a number of different ghosts, perhaps the most famous of which is Antonio de Sedela, better known as Pere Antoine, a Spanish friar who served as the head Catholic priest for the city of New Orleans from his arrival in 1774 to his death in 1829. During his life, Antoine was renowned for his compassion towards the city's underclasses, lending aid to the poor, to the incarcerated, and to the enslaved, even baptizing the famous Marie Laveau when she was a child, and working with her to bring freedom and equality to people of color in the city. In the centuries following his passing, Pere Antoine's spirit is most commonly said to be seen in the alleyway that bears his name, appearing in the dewy morning, humming hymns and holy songs as he strolls along. Witnesses claim to have seen him in other parts of the city as well, including St. Louis Cemetery, or the paths of the French Quarter by night. But the good priest is forever anchored to the cathedral, watching over it as a shepherd watches over his flock. But Pere Antoine was not the only famous monk haunting the cathedral. Dagobert de Longoria, originally from Quebec before emigrating to New Orleans, was the priest of the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans in 1745. Much like Antoine, Longoria was praised for his kindness and his dedication to the poor of New Orleans, running the charity hospital in the 1750s. And he had spent much of his time fraternizing with the populace, attending weddings, births, and funerals. Additionally, he was looked down upon by high-ranking individuals of the Catholic Church for engaging in behavior deemed beneath members of the order, such as wearing a tricorn hat and drinking excessively in local taverns. In the years following his death, the famed Capuchin monk has often been seen on the balcony or the altar, namely near the holidays, often holding a candle during the midnight mass. What's more is that some may hear him drunkenly singing the hymn Kylie on rainy mornings while strolling down Pirate's Alley, the shuffle of his sandals echoing down the road. While the monks of St. Louis Cathedral were generally peaceful during their lifetimes, one ghost of New Orleans was said to have lived a life of thrills and battles, notorious pirate Jean Lafitte. During his lifetime, Lafitte was a French-American privateer who operated in the Gulf of Mexico and the bayou of New Orleans, attacking Spanish ships, plundering treasures, fencing goods at his family's blacksmith shop, and smuggling enslaved people throughout the South. He gambled and drank, brawled with the toughest of the city, laid with the most beautiful women. And he also bolstered the economy of New Orleans through his illegal actions, founded island colonies, even participated in the War of 1812 in defense of the city. His outlaw reputation garnered him both honor and fear, and in the centuries following his death, he has become one of the most famous ghost legends of New Orleans. His spirit is primarily said to reside in Lafitte's blacksmith shop, now currently a cafe and bar, where he appears to survey the room before vanishing without a trace. Other places that Jean's ghost has been sighted include Pirate Alley alongside St. Louis Cathedral, leading an inebriated procession of his ghostly pirate crew through the streets of the French Quarter, and the Old Absinthe, where he reportedly shares a drink with the ghost of President Andrew Jackson. Perhaps the most haunted location in New Orleans is one with a sinister and cruel history embedded within its walls, the LaLaurie Mansion. For nearly 200 years, there have been reports of paranormal activity coming from the house at 1140 Royal Street, and many people who have stood near the house have reported feeling as if they were being taken over by a negative energy. Madame Delphine McCarthy LaLaurie was a wealthy New Orleans socialite and notorious enslaver who had purchased the property in 1831 with her third husband, Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie. Here she maintained a prominent position in New Orleans society, throwing lavish parties for other socialites, complete with music, fine food, and champagne. By November of that year, as the LaLauries were in the midst of a nasty domestic dispute, rumors circulated of Delphine's cruel treatment of her enslaved servants, such as a girl of 10 years falling to her death from the roof, attempting to escape a whip-wielding LaLaurie, and Madame LaLaurie keeping her cook chained to the kitchen stove, even beating her daughters when they attempted to feed the poor enslaved. On April 10, 1834, after a fire broke out at the LaLaurie Mansion, police discovered the 70-year-old cook chained to the stove by her ankle. Bystanders, including a local judge, broke down the doors to the slave quarters, finding people mutilated, suspended by the neck, limbs stretched, emaciated with signs of being flayed with a whip, and wearing spiked iron collars. When news of the tortured victims spread, a mob of local citizens ransacked the LaLaurie residence, and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. Meanwhile, the LaLauries fled via carriage, first to Alabama, and then to Paris, where Delphine LaLaurie lived out the rest of her life before her death in 1849. Soon after the LaLauries disappeared from New Orleans, superstition and folklore began to spread, with people claiming to hear the phantom screams of her victims echoing from the house in the dead of night. In the following decades, tales persisted of wails of agony, doors slamming, faucets suddenly turning on, and furniture moving on its own. Body imprints were found on beds that no one has slept on for years. Apparitions of enslaved people, some wearing chains, have been seen walking around the property. Despite the nearly 2 centuries which have passed since the fire in 1834, the events of that year are still told today, with facts woven with superstitious embellishment. Whatever the reality is, the LaLaurie Mansion was a place of cruelty and suffering, and has since become an entity all unto itself. Another notably haunted house is the Gardet-Le-Pret Mansion, also known as the Sultan's Palace. Sitting squarely in the French Quarter of New Orleans, and noted for being one of the most luxurious residences in town, The second owner, Jean-Baptiste Lepret, would occasionally rent out the house to short-term tenants when he left on summer holiday. One of which, dated circa 1850, was an alleged Turkish sultan who arrived with a full entourage, including a harem of 5 wives, servants, and trunks of precious silks and jewels. He was said to hold elaborate parties where people on the street could smell strong tobacco, alcohol fumes, and foreign incense being burned. However, the mysterious tenant was also incredibly paranoid, going as far as to install new locks on the doors and heavy drapes to hide what was going on inside the building. It made locals wonder, just what was he hiding? Revelations came one morning when a passerby saw blood seeping out from under the front door and onto the steps. When authorities entered the home, they found the occupants were massacred. Men, women, and even children were brutally dismembered, body parts scattered about the house. Initially, the Sultan was nowhere to be found, until they went to the backyard, and they found his hand sticking up from a freshly dug grave. Upon further investigation, the quote-unquote Sultan was in truth a con man, a lowly criminal who robbed a wealthy figure before fleeing to America. In retaliation, the man who was robbed had sent assassins to kill the false Sultan and send a message to his enemies. The story's authenticity is questionable, but ever since the mass murder, a number of paranormal occurrences have been witnessed at the house. Women's laughter emanating from the 3rd floor, a strange song sung by disembodied voices, a man's voice pleading for his life, followed instantly by cries of pain and low groans, veiled figures hovering between the floors and on stairwells before vanishing. Succeeding owners of the building have reportedly tried to exorcise the premises with holy water, but the spirits are said to have remained steadfast, refusing to vacate the Sultan's palace. Our final ghost is perhaps the most famous figure in New Orleans history, Marie Laveau. Popularly referred to as the Queen of Voodoo, Laveau was a devout practitioner of the Voodoo religion, one whose life was notably mysterious. While some contemporaries dismissed her as nothing but an evil occultist who practiced black magic and hosted orgies, New Orleans community knew her as a healer and herbalist who preserved traditional African beliefs while melding them with those of the New World. During her lifetime, she gained respect and prominence in the city for hosting influential community members in her home and offering advice, spiritual guidance tied to both Voodoo and Catholicism, and aid to the sick. She performed notable acts of community service, such as nursing yellow fever patients, posting bail for free women of color, and visiting death row inmates to pray with them in their final hours. Additionally, Laveau led elaborate ceremonies along the shores of Lake Pontchartrain. Following her death in 1881, her legend only continued to grow, and it is said that her ghost roams all over New Orleans, but especially the location of the former St. Anne Cottage and her tomb located in St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery. Whereas other ghosts of New Orleans are said to terrorize the living, projecting their pain or going about their business as if they had never died, those who encounter the ghost of Marie Laveau are said to feel a sense of healing, of comfort, and may even obtain a touch of wisdom. Stories of spirits of the deceased lingering in the land of the living are nothing new, and found practically worldwide. And yet the ghost stories of New Orleans, Louisiana, managed to stand out among the sea of paranormal tales, so much so that the city offers ghost tours of alleged haunted sites, where tourists get to not only see the places, but learn of the phantoms forever bound to them. Some are benevolent or otherwise harmless towards the living, whereas others are quite wicked. Ghosts of priests, pirates, tortured souls and their torturers, the Voodoo Queen, and countless others are all said to walk the streets of the Big Easy. So the next time you find yourself in New Orleans, take heed. You may be in the presence of a ghost.